Thanks very much. And I'm really glad to see there are actually some young people here. And I have to tell you, unfortunately, you have a problem. You have a big problem. And I don't want to spend all of my time on gloom and doom and problem. What you really need to know is that the solution is dependent upon you. You know, it's not enough to elect a politician who says they're going to solve the problem. You know, we've tried that actually. Barack Obama was elected because of the support of young people who caused him to overcome Hillary in the Iowa primaries. And he said all the right words, that we have a planet in peril, and thanks. But he wasted the crisis. He had a crisis, and you should never waste a crisis. He had this economic crisis in 2008, and he could have taken steps that would have really changed the direction in the United States and then in the world, but that didn't happen. So you need to influence the system. It's great to do individual actions that try to reduce your emissions and things, but that's not going to solve the problem. You actually have to affect the political system. So that's what I want to, that's an old book. That's 10 years old. And within the next few months, I'm going to finish my second book, which is Sophie's Planet. And it's referring to your planet, to the planet of all young people. And I'm going to try to help you understand what is needed. Let me, am I controlling this? I control it this way. Yeah, actually it's encouraging that some young people are beginning to realize that there is a crisis. And I hope that their numbers grow, but numbers are not enough. We have to have leaders who actually will do the right things. So that's what I want to try to help you understand. Now, I was lucky to be grown up, to grow up at a time when it was not difficult for the child of a tenant farmer to go to the university. You know, it was mentioned I was born in 1941. I was born before the United States entered World War II. So I have seen a lot. And, you know, we need to understand, at that era, I grew up in the era of Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy. Truman was actually a great president. You know, when he campaigned in 1948 against Dewey, he went into the South and argued for civil rights at a time decades ahead of the other politicians. And he was the author of the Marshall Plan. He didn't want his name on it because that would have made it harder for it to get accepted by Congress. But he was the one responsible for the Marshall Plan. And you know, at that time, the United States helped form the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and set up these organizations which were essential for the progress that was made. And it was not a case of zero-sum game. The United States actually gave a lot of money and credit to the defeated nations, included Germany and Japan. The standard of living throughout the Western world increased. It's not a zero-sum game. And the United States exercised leadership, which is going to be all the more essential for the problems that exist, not just a climate problem, but cybersecurity, pandemics, control, avoidance of nuclear problems. You need to have strong international organizations, and so we can't abandon that and make it every country for itself. Okay. The other thing, you know, I was lucky to study under Professor Van Allen, who discovered the radiation belts around the Earth. He had the instrument on the very first United States satellite. But I learned in his physics department the scientific method. It seems very simple. You have to study all of the available data on the problem of interest, and you need to be very skeptical of your interpretation, because you're the easiest one to fool. And when you get new data, you have to reassess your interpretation from scratch. And perhaps most difficult, you can't let your preference or your ideology affect your assessment of the problem. That sounds simple, but in fact it's difficult, even among professional scientists. You tend to get to have an opinion or a preference and are not looking at the data in a completely unbiased and skeptical way. And just to, there's an article that just came out a couple of days ago in the newspaper showing the change of inflation-adjusted income for each age group. And you see how our politics have rigged the system in favor of old people. The income of the younger people has not increased at all, while the older people has substantially. And make it even more obvious, this is the federal debt as a share of the gross domestic product. In other words, and it's showing how the federal debt is continuing to increase. So old people are borrowing money from you, and you're going to have to pay back, and the interest on the federal debt is a problem, and it's going to become a bigger problem. And this is because, again, the system has been rigged against you. So you should be getting mad. You know, you need to understand this. Now, okay, now it can be fixed, but you need to understand the system. Let's talk about the climate situation. Basically, it's hard to recognize that there's a crisis because the climate system has tremendous inertia, and that comes mainly from the ocean, which is 4 kilometers deep. So as you apply some forcing to the climate system, it can only change slowly. The ocean temperature can only change slowly. And what that means is that we're now forcing the system, but the system has only partly responded to that forcing. because of the inertia. So there's more, and the forcing that we're applying is greenhouse gases, which carbon dioxide and methane, and a few other gases, which reduce heat radiation to space. So that causes an energy imbalance. So there's more energy coming in from the sun than heat radiated to space. And so the planet, of course, warms up, but it takes the ocean a long time to warm up. And so there's still more warming in the pipeline. The planet is out of balance now. And our climate system turns out to be sensitive. There are amplifying feedbacks in the system. For example, as the planet gets warmer, it reduces the area of ice and snow. And that causes absorption of more sunlight because the surface that's exposed underneath the ice and snow is darker than the ice and snow, so it absorbs more sunlight. So that's an example of an amplifying feedback. It turns out that our climates, and there are diminishing feedbacks also, but it turns out our climate system is dominated by amplifying feedbacks. And that's the reason that we can have large climate oscillations. This part of the planet, essentially all of Canada and parts of the United States were under ice, an ice sheet, 20,000 years ago. As a result of a very weak forcing, small perturbations in the Earth's orbit, but because of these amplifying feedbacks, when they have enough time, they can cause a very large climate change. So the danger is that we can push the system to the point where we lose control of the system because of the amplifying feedback. So that's what we have to avoid. And we're getting very close to a very dangerous situation. Temperature has increased more than 1 degree Celsius, or about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, averaged over the planet and averaged over the last 100 years, with most of that warming in the last 50 years, which makes the temperature warmer than it has been in the Holocene, which is the current interglacial period. The maximum was about 0.5 degree Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial level, but we're now more than 1 degree Celsius warmer. So we're now well outside the range of this period in which civilization developed. And as I've already mentioned, because of the blanketing effect of these gases, the planet is out of energy balance, and we can now measure how far the planet is out of energy balance. Because where does that energy go? Well, it has to go into the ocean, because the conductivity of the continents is very low, so it's only the upper tens of meters of the soil that will change temperature over a time scale of decades or a century. But the ocean mixes, and so you can mix heat into a very deep ocean. So that's where the energy goes, and we now measure the temperature very accurately, and when we find that the planet is out of energy balance, with more the upper ocean gaining heat and the deeper ocean gaining heat and some ice melting and some heat going into the ground, the total imbalance is now about 3/4 of a watt per meter squared, which doesn't sound like much, but it's the equivalent of exploding 500,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs per day, every day of the year. That's how much extra energy is going into the ocean, and it's warming the ocean. And one of the consequences, and this is actually the most threatening consequence for young people and future generations, and that's the change of the sea level. As the ocean warms, it melts the ice shelves, the tongues of ice that come out from Antarctica and Greenland into the ocean. those begin to melt as the ocean gets warmer, and that allows the ice sheets to discharge their icebergs to the ocean faster. And so as a result, the sea level is beginning to rise. The rate now is a little more than 3 millimeters a year, which is a little more than a foot in a century, which is a nuisance, but not a huge disaster. But that rate of melt has doubled, more than doubled, twice in the last century. And if we continue with business as usual on greenhouse gases, our modeling suggests that we'll get several more doublings, and we'll get to the point of getting several meters of sea level rise on a time scale of 50 to 150 years. If we let that happen, that would mean that all coastal cities would become dysfunctional. And the economic, more than half of the large cities in the world are on coastlines. So we can't let that happen. The economic consequences and the human consequences would be unbelievable. Entire nations like Bangladesh and the Netherlands and Florida and a few 100 million people in China would be underwater if we go down that path. The other thing that is irreversible on any time scale that people would care about is extermination of species. We're putting pressure on different species in many different ways. But if you combine that with a shifting of climate zones, then many species cannot move fast enough to stay within a climate zone that they can survive in. And so there's the danger of pushing a significant fraction of the species on the planet to extinction. So another reason why we don't want large climate change to occur. For example, coral reefs, there's more than 1 million species associated with coral reefs, and we're now losing coral reefs at a rate of more than 1% a year due to both the warming of the ocean and the acidification of the ocean from the carbon dioxide. So again, a reason why we need to stop the growth of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And we can also see on a regional scale, you can begin to see that the planet is getting warmer. The natural variability of local temperature is larger than the global warming of 2 degrees Fahrenheit. But especially in the summer, you should be able, if you're as old as I am, you should notice that the seasons are getting warmer. This shows the United States, the summer season and the winter season. And you see the summer season, the bell curve that describes the range of summer mean temperatures. The natural variability range is shifting toward warmer temperatures, and it should be noticeable in the summer. It's shifted by more than 1 standard deviation. In the winter, the shift is not as large, but if you go to other parts of the world, if you go to the subtropics, the Mediterranean and the Middle East, the shift is larger in the summer, so that every summer is now warmer than it was 50 years ago. And in tropical regions like Southeast Asia, these regions are becoming uncomfortable in the summer. That is, if we allow that, again, if we stay on the path that we're on, these parts of the world will become less habitable, will increase the migration pressure from these regions. And of course, these regions are not the ones that are causing the problem. Most of the emissions are coming from the wealthy, high-latitude nations. So it's a case of injustice, but it will be a problem for everybody, not just those regions. So this shifting of the temperature curve does have an effect on regional climate, which is beginning to be noticeable. Where the dry regions, you get greater summer temperature extremes and more extreme droughts and the fires that go with that. But at the times, you also get more evaporation. So the places that are wet tend to get more extreme wetness. So you get more extreme floods in those parts of the world that are wet, or those times that you get rainfall. It can be heavier because a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. So we see this in the fires. This happens to be in Greece last year, and that's some of the impact of that. And we see in the United States the fires, wildfires are increasing, and the floods, the 100-year floods, are occurring more than once a century. This is in Japan, where they had incredible floods this last summer. And those storms that are driven by latent heat of water vapor can become stronger. That means tropical storms, tornadoes, and thunderstorms have the potential to be stronger because there's more water vapor in the atmosphere and the ocean surface is warmer. So these are the potential injustices. It's today's adults to young people, but also the north to the south, because we in the north are burning most of the world's carbon budget, and the consequences are felt worldwide. And then, of course, it's humans to all of the species. So in a sense, though, you can say all of these are injustices of the older generation to the younger generation. So this is what you should be aware of. But of course, you can't simply say, well, let's stop with the fossil fuels, let's stop with the energy. The fossil fuels are what fueled the Industrial Revolution, what allowed the world to dispense with slavery. When the Industrial Revolution allowed machines to provide enormous amount of work. One gallon of gasoline contains a few hundred, about 400 hours of labor by an adult, healthy adult. So the fossil fuels were extremely useful in raising the standards of living. You need energy if you want to have high standards of living. But what's happening is almost all of our energy is coming from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And regardless of what you hear from the politicians, we're not solving the problem. The fossil fuel use, if we're going to stabilize climate, it actually has to decrease fairly rapidly. And instead, it's increasing. Maybe the rate of growth is slowing down a bit, but it actually has to decrease rapidly, and that's not happening. And in good part, it's because there are still parts of the world where they're trying to raise their people out of poverty. China has done a good job of raising the standard of living over the last couple of decades. India now wants to follow the same path, and their population is going to pass that of China's within the next few years. And they're getting most of their energy, not only from fossil fuels, but most of it is from coal, which is the most carbon intensive of the fossil fuels. And there's plenty more in the ground. We actually have to phase down. If we want to stabilize climate, we've already burned most of the carbon that we can afford to burn. We're going to need to decrease emissions, but there's enough in the ground to completely destroy the planet. So we need alternatives. And there's another side to this, talking about human health. There's a very interesting experiment done inadvertently in China when Chinese government provided free coal to people in the north half of China for heating during the winter. And and this continued for several decades. And so then they have the data to see the impact of that. And it reduced the life expectancy by 5.5 years. Just the breathing in of the air pollution from burning coal. And we now have studies of the World Health Organization which show that more than 3.5 million people a year are dying from outdoor air pollution. Most of this associated with fossil fuels. Both respiratory problems and cardiac problems, because the small particles that are produced are actually, when you breathe them in, they actually get into the bloodstream. So that's more than 10,000 people a day are dying from the outdoor air pollution. And a similar number are dying from indoor air pollution, which again, a significant fraction of that is from fossil fuel burning. If we look at the cumulative emissions, the climate change is caused not by today's emissions, but by the total emissions over time. And if we look at the cumulative emissions of the different countries, what we see is that countries like the United States and United Kingdom and Germany are 10 times more responsible for the climate change than countries like China and India. Even though China and India are now number 1 and number 3 in emissions, historically their emissions were not so large. So, in this new book, which is almost finished, I want young people to understand that they have the potential to actually change this system, but they need to understand, and we need to use the scientific method, which I already discussed. The crucial requirement is abundant, clean, carbon-free energy. And this is not going to happen unless you have alternatives which are economically competitive with the fossil fuels. Here's an example of doing the same experiment and getting the same result and not understanding it. About 25, 35 years ago, the case was made very effectively by Amory Lovins, very persuasively, I should say, that, well, if you pay attention to energy efficiency, that you can do away with the fossil fuels. And he says you don't need large hydro, you don't need nuclear power, you don't need fossil fuels. And so he had this plan, and that basically is what the liberal side of our political spectrum has been following. You know, I've tried to talk to people like Al Gore and others, but they're totally under the sway of Amory Lovins. And yet I keep making this graph and showing, well, Amory's plan is this dash dot curve. Let's see if this works. Well, you can see that the dash dot curve was the plan for what the renewables were going to provide, the soft renewables, not including hydro. Even though we're very heavily subsidized renewables, and I'm not against renewables, they're part of the solution. My barn is covered with solar panels, but that's not enough, and renewables are intermittent. So we're not solving the problem. We're pretending that we're solving the problem, but we're not. So the critical element in the solution is you have to make the price of fossil fuels include their cost to society. And that means the human health cost and the climate change costs. And the way to do that, the practical way to do that, would be to collect a fee instead from the fossil fuel companies, collect it at the source, the mine or the port of entry. But instead, what we're doing is subsidizing. We're actually paying these fossil fuel companies to deliver us this stuff which is causing the problem. If we want to move to clean energies, we have to make the prices honest. You've got to include the cost to society in the cost of the fossil fuels. And one way to do that, and I think the only practical way, is to collect a fee from the fossil fuel companies. But that's going to make gasoline at the pump become more expensive. Electricity, if it's generated by coal, it's going to become more expensive. So give the money that you collect to the public, an equal amount to all legal residents, and that way those people that pay attention to their fossil fuel use will actually make money. In fact, with the present distribution of energy, 70% of the people would come out ahead if you distribute the money uniformly. And this is a progressive fee because low-income people don't have as big a carbon footprint as wealthy people who have bigger houses and who travel more. So it has some social benefit as well as being the only way we're going to phase down fossil fuels and replace them with clean energies. And this is a very transparent, it's a market-based solution which conservatives actually favor. It's just that our conservative party in the United States is totally dominated by fossil fuel money. So even though the thought leaders in the conservative side actually favor this, and you may have seen people like James Baker III and George Shultz, old conservatives, who actually come out and they're arguing for carbon fee and dividend, exactly the policy that we've been pushing for 12 years, because it's a conservative approach. Let the market help you find the most efficient ways to move off of fossil fuels. And that it stimulates the economy, and the economic studies show that in the United States it would generate a few million new jobs. And this is the only the viable international solution, because you can put, if the United States would do this, we would then put border duties on products from countries that don't have an equivalent carbon fee, and that would be a big incentive for them to have their own carbon fee, so that they could collect the money themselves rather than have us collect it. But in addition, you do still need some regulations in certain cases, and you do need to support technology development, the long lead, research, development, and demonstration. And I think that we need to have available the option of advanced generation nuclear power. We stopped development several decades ago. The military made the decision of the type of nuclear power that we had because they wanted the technology that was needed for nuclear submarines. And that was what was used for light water reactors. It's not an optimum technology. We know lots of ways to do it better and safer, but they've not been fully developed to a commercial status. And then, there was this movie, China Syndrome, which coincided with an accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, and managed to frighten people. They even evacuated people around 3 Mile Island. In fact, nobody was ever killed by the radiation from 3 Mile Island. And at the same time, 10,000 people a day are dying from radiation from fossil fuel burning, and it doesn't scare people. They had a nuclear accident at Fukushima and forced people to evacuate. Nobody has died from that radiation, but more than 100 people died from radiophobia, the fear and the heartbreak of being forced to evacuate from their homes. But you would not build that technology again anyhow. There were a lot of, but what happened? I guess I can't. Can I control this? Yeah, I guess I can control this. Oh, we don't have sound. Yeah, okay, I guess I can't play this. Okay, so I'll go to the next one. Yeah, I was going to show you this 200,000 people at a concert in New York City, in which they, and Ralph Nader was hyperventilating about nuclear power and how we should be using the sun, not nuclear power. And they're singing a song, "Give me the warm glow of a wood fire." 10,000 people a day are dying from indoor air pollution. There's just a complete irrationality to the assessment of the pros and cons of the different energy sources. You have to look at them objectively and then consider, well, what is the potential of the next technology? And we're just not doing that. We're letting emotions. Now, I'm no longer synced up with my computer. Is that my chart?
Just trying to get this one back to sync up with that.
Okay. Okay. But I'm not, oh yeah. Well, yeah. This doesn't work either. You know, I've been arrested a number of times protesting mountaintop removal or tar sands pipelines. The problem is that the governments are not going to, I mean, it's drawing attention to a foolish activity. We cannot afford to develop the worst, most carbon-intensive fuels like tar sands, where you get much more carbon. It doesn't make sense. We should be developing clean energies. But just drawing attention to that does not stop. The government is not going to let the lights go out. So unless you have some alternative energies, these protests are just not going to be effective. I think after the last few decades of trying to influence our two political parties, I'm convinced that we need a third party. And it's all the more true today where the two parties have moved to the two extremes. I think we need a centrist party. And it's going to be up to young people to make that decision and to support it. But you know, they've proven that they can have a huge impact. The last election, Bernie Sanders almost overtook Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary because young people were out in the streets and were supporting Bernie Sanders. But Bernie Sanders is basically a socialist. You know, the central United States is not going to go for that. I think that we need a party in which you go back to something like the kind of conventions that were held half a century ago, where you actually have some power in the delegates. You vote for delegates and for a platform, and a difficulty with the third party is that they can be a spoiler, like Ralph Nader in one of the elections. You don't want somebody who's on an ego trip heading the party. The party, the committee controlling the party should actually make a decision well before the election. Does it make sense for the third party candidate to continue to the actual election? It's argued that it's very difficult for a third party candidate to win in the United States. Actually, H. Ross Perot got 20% of the vote, even though he was a little guy, a little Texan who saw Martians on his front yard. But people were so fed up with the other two parties that he was able to get 20%. So you can imagine if you actually had a good candidate, I think a third two-party candidate can eventually win. But at the beginning, it may be necessary to just elect some representatives. If you even get a few representatives in Congress, you can begin to be the swing vote. And if you have a sensible platform, then I think the public is ready to move away from these two extremes. We get the big noise from the two extremes, but I don't think most of the public is in either one of those extremes. And I don't see us solving the climate problem if we're just oscillating between those two extremes. One thing that we certainly, and I've not tried to define the platform because I think young people should define the platform, but one thing that it needs to have is we need to move to ranked voting. And there are a couple of states that are doing that. And by ranked voting, I mean when you vote, you list your preferences, all of them in order. So if there are 3 candidates, you give your first, second, and third choices. And if nobody gets 50%, then the candidate on your list that you had third will drop off. The candidate that got the least number of votes will drop off, and if you voted for that one, then your number 1 choice, if that was your number 1 choice, then your number 2 choice will become your choice. That's ranked voting. I didn't explain it very well, but it's the way in which you get a recount without having to re-vote. So you immediately, if nobody gets 50%, you immediately go to the candidate that gets the most votes when the lowest candidate has been eliminated. That way, third party, the problem with the third party is basically eliminated. But it requires changing the rules or the constitution of individual states, but it is beginning to be understood that that's really a way in which our government in the U.S. could work better. And I have one suggestion for that's backward. Let me go this way. Huh. Oh, okay. This Chief Yellow Smoke. My great-grandparents immigrated to the United States from Denmark and settled in western Iowa at a time when it was still tall grass prairie with a few groves of trees. But there was this, and the Omaha Indians were, Native Americans were the principal tribe in that region. And Chief Yellow Smoke befriended my great-grandfather. But then the railroad came through in 1866, and they made a small town. There were almost no people a decade earlier. It was settled very quickly at that time. But he took to gambling at the saloon in Dunlap, and when he demanded his winnings, he was murdered. Somebody hit him in the head and crushed his skull. And he ended up buried on my great-grandfather's property. There's a book recently published by Ed Wilson, the biologist at Harvard University, in which he's arguing on behalf of all the other species on the planet, and he's saying we need to reserve half of the planet for the other species. Well, it's not very realistic, I think, to think that we're going to abandon half of the planet and give it to the other species. But on the other hand, you know, one of the problems that we've shown is that the species get in trouble when they cannot migrate because the climate zones are shifting. And humans are sort of taking over the planet, and that prevents species from migrating to stay within the climate zone that they can survive in. So I would propose, and you know, and also in my book I talk about our mistreatment of the Native Americans. We still have a debt to them. We could have, and I think we should set aside land, north-south strip of land, which would allow for wildlife and other species on the planet to exist, and which could be managed by Native Americans, those who prefer, there are some of them who prefer to maintain some of their customs and lifestyles. And rather than just having individual national parks here and there, I think like the Appalachian Trail all the way along in the East Coast, you should have a zone in the other half of the country which would be useful for preserving species. And I would argue to include that in the platform. But it could be basically funded by donations over a period of time, and it slowly grows over time. Anyway, that would be one of my suggestions, but I think the platform should be decided by young people. But I think we need a party which is based on the principles that our government was founded on, and which we've gotten away from. And I think it's very hard to push the existing parties back. I think it's easier to start over cleanly with a third party. Thanks. So I guess we have time for discussion. Is there a microphone?
Dr. Hansen, you're saying that renewables are intermittent simply because we have conservative people, conservative ideas about how to use existing carbon creating, in other words, the capitalist system. Is that why you don't think we have a future with just renewables? Or is
I'm not quite clear on what your question is.
Well,
Could you repeat that?
We're not even using several solar concepts like tidal energy and a few other things, and even groundwater. You know, groundwater is a consistent 50, 55 degrees all year round. And we can heat up our homes with air conditioning. That right now, forced air conditioning is an extremely expensive, wasteful electric user, where this would just be a little pump, and you can heat up your homes. Now, solar is the big thing that's moving forward now to eliminate fossil fuels, and that's heating our homes in winter. What I'm saying is, renewables have been used to a lot lower degree of acceptance, and still is to a not fully utilized.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of potential in different renewables. As I mentioned, we generate more electricity than we use on my farm. We also have a heat pump, which is a very good, efficient way to take advantage of heat capacity. But we need to let those, but if we just subsidize those, we find that we never get there. You know, the reason that I could afford to put these solar panels on the barn was I got big subsidies from Pennsylvania, and 30% of it paid by the federal government. And as long as only a few percent of the people are doing that, then then it works. But if 100% of the people do that, then you're paying yourself, and so you can't get a subsidy. So rather than doing it by subsidies, we need to make the price of the fossil fuels rise and then let these alternatives compete. And renewables will be part of the story, but may not be all of it, and probably won't be all of it. If you look at the studies, the recent one that came out of MIT, it's very, you know, one problem with renewables, they actually become harder as they become a bigger fraction of your total. It becomes more difficult to integrate them into the system because of their intermittency. So we need to be open-minded and let the alternatives compete. That's why I say every time there's new information, I try to reset my thinking. But I haven't yet found persuasive evidence that renewables are going to do the whole job. In fact, the studies actually suggest that's very difficult. And Germany is trying very hard to prove that you can do 100% renewables. But what they're actually proving, what they seem to be proving, is the opposite. Their electricity prices are more than double those in France, and yet their emissions they're sort of stabilized, and they've built new coal-fired power plants because they're closing some nuclear plants, and they just can't get all their energy from renewables. So it's as I say, let them compete, but make the fossil fuels pay their cost to society.
I would like to comment. You're on Long Island, and I'm sure you're well aware that Long Island fought a nuclear power plant, the Shoreham nuclear power plant, and I'm so delighted that they did, because that technology is so dangerous. And for you to say that no one died at Fukushima, I think is a very extreme statement. And 3 Mile Island, and you didn't mention Chernobyl. But we really haven't exhausted these other technologies. And as you said, yes, they do cost more, and you were supplemented with your solar panels. But why not take this carbon tax that you're talking about and use that money to do more R&D? Because there's not been enough attention put towards real clean, because nuclear is not clean. It's extremely dangerous, and you can stop coal power plants, but once you have radiation on the planet, they don't even know what to do with the waste we have now. And I'm really surprised that's your position. Thank you.
Yeah. See, there are so many misconceptions in what you just said. Maybe I'll try to mention a couple of them. So, waste, for example. Nuclear waste is contained in vessels and harms nobody. The waste from fossil fuel burning is killing 10,000 people a day. The waste from solar panels is not negligible. You've got chromium, mercury, cadmium, different toxic elements that are then released when those solar panels are taken down and disassembled in the poorer communities, and maybe even shipped to Africa or shipped to China. Stopped accepting them. They don't want this pollution. So it's not, every source of energy has got problems, and so you need to objectively compare them. And and this idea that we're going to take the money from tax and use that to subsidize or to do some R&D on your favorite idea for what you think everybody should be doing, that is exactly what is killing young people, because there's no way that the public is going to accept a tax on fossil fuels if the money is going to your favorite charity.
Well, it sounds like nuclear is your favorite charity, and I'd rather, and
No,
I said
no.
R&D, not for things that exist already that are creating pollution. For example, we have an ocean, as you mentioned, that's a perpetual motion machine. We have, rivers, and we have tidal, the ebb and flow every single day, and we're not taking advantage of a lot of things that are truly clean. And it's not my favorite pet project, sir. It's ones that would truly be clean and have less impact.
Let the market decide. But see if I have a chart here. I don't see it. Well, Bill Clinton, in his first State of the Union message, said, we're eliminating R&D on nuclear power, which is not needed. And at the same time, the Department of Energy was ready to do a demonstration plant on a fast reactor, which could burn 99% of the energy in the nuclear fuel. The present reactors burn 0.6% of the energy in the fuel. It's a crazy way to do it, but it's the way that Admiral Rickover chose, because he wanted plutonium. They wanted plutonium for weapons, and they wanted a reactor that could fuel submarines, nuclear submarines, and stay underwater for months at a time without having to surface. And so he got his way. The military had the strongest voice. And we turned down, we just didn't do the alternative R&D on things like thorium-fueled molten salt reactors, which the nuclear experts really wanted to do because they wanted to make nuclear power for peaceful purposes, not weapons. But that didn't happen. And then you've got this. I wouldn't. You can build nuclear reactors which operate at atmospheric pressure and are inherently safe. And even if you look at the 50-year-old technology, its safety record is actually quite good. How many people have been killed in the United States by nuclear accidents? I think it's 0 with 100 reactors. But that's old technology. I wouldn't build that again. You can do much better than that. But you should. But this should be decided. It shouldn't be forced on the public. If California says we don't want to have nuclear reactors, or if New York says they don't, then fine. But maybe Georgia wants them because they have very little sunshine, very cloudy place. But we need to develop the options, and I think, this is a case of old geezers forcing on young people a solution or a non-solution, which I think is very inappropriate. I understand how the emotions were churned up in the 3 Mile Island era, even though 3 Mile Island did not kill anybody.
Hello, I'd like to say something. I am German. I live in England. We have islands in Papua New Guinea, a whole atoll. We have a game farm in South Africa. I learned English in San Francisco. I'm 53 this year. I'm not a specialist in anything, and I appreciate you are through research and everything. I'm a specialist maybe close to in what the benefits of a vegan diet are for the planet, for our health, and for the animals. That's where I started. But my niece's long-term partner, well, 3 years, she's only 23, he's 10 years older than her. He built the first all-sustainable village city with about 5,000 inhabitants. That's all sustainable in Weinsberg in Germany. That's not far away from Stuttgart, southwest. And they all told him it can't be done, and it works. And we have minus 18 in the winter and up to plus 40 in the summer. It's working. And what I was saying about Fukushima, it's called The Silent Ocean by Ivan Mcfadden, and he sailed in 2004 from Melbourne all the way up to Osaka, San Francisco, down to LA and back to Melbourne, and the ocean was beautiful, lots of birds, lots of fish, and he did it 10 years later in 1314, and the ocean was silent and dead, and after Fukushima happened, the tsunami, there was rubbish everywhere, and no more fish, no more birds, as I said, and we're seeing it on the conflict islands. We bought them in 2008, and there were plenty of big fish when you were diving. Now the big fish are gone, and the whales and the dolphins are coming so close to shore. It's quite nice for us to see, but the big fish are missing. The tuna is gone, the marlins. And when we arrived there in 2008, there were huge fish lying around. It was fisherman's heaven. These big fish are gone. I mean, pretty much gone. I mean, not visible to the eye anymore as they were. And that happened in a few years. So there is something happening. And in Germany, in '86, I was 20 when Chernobyl happened. We couldn't eat the salad. Everybody was thrown away, the harvests. It does affect people. And there's other older reactors. I mean, Angela Merkel wants to ban nuclear power because it is not safe. So
I think it would be a very wise idea to ban Soviet old nuclear reactors. Would be a very smart thing to do. But now, are you attributing this change in fish to Fukushima? You see, so if our society has become that unscientific, then we're in deep doo-doo. You can measure the products of Fukushima on the coastline of the United States. And it's several orders of magnitude below anything that would have any effect. There are problems in our wildlife in the ocean, that's for sure. But to relate that to Fukushima is completely unscientific. We do have a lot of...
They're living there. They're not measuring there. But here in East Coast, isn't that what you just said? In the West. In England.
Okay, are there other questions? There.
Thank you. It's my understanding that the global food industry is playing the largest role in this issue we're facing. Do you feel that increasing local food production can be a solution?
Global food production? Is that the question?
Well, do you feel that increasing local food production can be a solution?
The food production, the way we do it, does have an impact on climate. As it's very well known, a heavy meat-based diet has a much greater footprint on the planet than a more vegetarian type diet. What is happening as we continue to phase off of fossil fuels, the United Nations studies their scenarios for the future. The only way they can get the climate to stabilize is to assume that, we're going to have a lot of sucking of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And their principal scheme for doing that is growing crops, which for fuel, burning these biofuels and capturing the CO2. But that then takes away from food production. It's not a very plausible scheme. But there are ways that we can grow food that would actually alleviate the climate problem. One of those ways is fertilizing with rock dust, including when fertilizing to speed up the natural drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide and the deposition of that carbon on the ocean floor as limestone. So there are ways that you can modify food production to make it actually carbon negative. That's something that's being researched now and is, I think, has a lot of potential. Do we have any other people? There's one in the back.
I'll hand it to you, okay?
Hello, good afternoon, sir. As a young person witnessing this discussion right now, there is one question that, a very basic question I think that keeps popping into my head. And that is at what point do we introduce the discussion of restructuring our society, our economy, to generally reduce our consumption of energy in general, our consumption of electricity and external energy inputs? At what point do we promote a locally based economy, local small-scale food production, and in general, maybe a more of a bartering style in relationship with our neighbors? Is this something that you would consider promoting in your discussion of sustainability?
Yes, and I don't think you achieve it by preaching. I think that, we can say, oh, we're wasting energy. But the problem is, there are people, the population is still increasing, and it's going to be increasing for a while. The way to address population, by the way, is to have abundant, affordable, clean energy. Because what happens is that if you develop, as countries become wealthier, the women decide they don't want to have so many children. And so the wealthy countries, the fertility rates are actually below the replenishment level. So I think population problem is solvable on the long run if we have abundant, clean energy and affordable energy. But many people say, oh, let's stop buying so much. Let's reduce our. Well, the problem is people like to travel, and they're going to do it. So you can personally decide you're not going to do it, but that's not. I'm afraid that's not a global solution. But you can encourage that, and not by preaching, but by economics. So as you put this rising price on carbon, it's going to make travel and consumption more expensive if it's carbon-based. Now, as we phase out fossil fuels, you may want to continue to have an energy fee. If you want to encourage local production, then these fees do that, because then we import food from New Zealand because fossil fuels are so darn cheap that you can do it. But as they become more expensive, that encourages the nearby farms. So there are steps you can take to move in that direction. And also just the fact that the organic farming is healthier. We do have a problem of these factory farms producing food that is not the most nutritious food. So we can move in that direction of supporting the small scale healthy farms, but I just don't think we can do it by preaching. We've got to actually have the economic incentives there. How about what?
Windmills. Now, funny that windmills all over. You go to South Carolina, that's Queens.
Yeah. The place they have the most windmills actually is in my home state of Iowa, which is getting 30% of its electricity from windmills. That's a real contribution, not the 2% type. But Iowa's also burning a lot of coal to supplement that. So the question is, how do you get to zero carbon? And the way you do, I think, and the realistic studies show, is by letting the alternatives compete. don't subsidize your favorite, whatever it is, because that's not going to go global. You may get it to, that's the way to do is to allow all the alternatives to compete.
Thank you very much. Cause and effect is a scientific principle, correct? I guess I don't have to give an elaboration of that. Well, for example, if the soil is dry and the plants are dying, and then a big storm comes and the rain goes on the soil, and then all of a sudden, days later, there's things that are growing. It's the effect of the cause, which was that the rain came, and now there's plants growing. Well, there's sharp rises. There are many studies that have been published about after a nuclear accident, a sharp rise in cancers in the areas around the nuclear power plants. Shoreham had a crack in its foundation, and at that time, there was a sharp rise of breast cancer in Long Island, which is why the residents of that area organized and to have it shut down, because there was that correlation. There's someone in my neighborhood, and a neighbor of mine who's from Japan, and she just went to visit her family with her children. And I said, how is it over there? How is the health of the people? Do you hear anything about what's going on? Because I'm thinking about Fukushima. She said, well, there is a problem. There's an epidemic of children with thyroid cancer. And I thought, well, when would there ever be an epidemic of children with thyroid cancer? I said, how do you know about this? She said, it's in the news every night. They're showing children, they're dying from thyroid cancer. I said, well, did they talk about what it's from? She said, I said, do they mention Fukushima? She said, no, we're not allowed to even say the word Fukushima. The media is forbidden to discuss Fukushima. They're supposed to deal with it as if it never happened. I said, well, what are they saying it's from? She said, they're saying it's from the heat. There's too much heat, and that's why the children are dying. And there are studies, wherever there was a nuclear power plant release, that indicate rises of cancer. So that's the cause and effect, and I don't think that's necessarily unscientific. The problem with radioactivity is that you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, and you really can't feel it. That doesn't mean it's not there. We know it's there because we're utilizing it as an energy source. There's something there that we're utilizing. And it has a half-life, it destroys cellular membranes and causes free radicals, and is very destructive and takes long, long time to dissipate. So I think it's something to consider as a threat for all of us. Thank you so much for the opportunity to say this and for discussing this with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.